Rain hammered the roof of the old house as if trying to warn me away, but by the time I reached the porch, my curiosity had already grown heavier than the storm. The locals called it a hungry place, a house that didn't keep secrets so much as swallow them whole. Its windows stared back at me like glass eyes, reflecting nothing, not even my own shape. For a moment, I wondered if I had walked into a space the world had forgotten. Inside, the air felt wrong. It wasn't the damp, moldy chill of an abandoned building, it was warmer, almost living. The floorboards didn't creak under my weight, they shifted, as though adjusting themselves to accommodate me. A faint hum threaded through the silence, something too soft to understand but too present to ignore. I told myself it was the storm settling in. I told myself a lot of things. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied, landing on a long hallway stretched far beyond what the house should physically hold. Doors lined both sides, all cracked open, as if waiting for me to choose one. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the house itself, as if the walls were leaning forward, listening, breathing, deciding. And then I heard it. A whisper. My name. Spoken in a voice that sounded old, layered with dozens of others. I turned, heart pounding, but nothing was there. Only the darkness thickening behind me, closing the way I came. That was when I realized the rumors weren't warnings. They were promises. The journey toward the abandoned house begins long before the protagonist reaches its rotting gate. Rumors cling to the place like cobwebs, each story darker than the last, passed from one trembling voice to another in hushed tones. The locals speak of vanished travelers, strange lights pulsing behind boarded windows, and the way the house seems to breathe when the wind dies. The protagonist, driven by a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and a quiet need to confront something unnamed within themselves, decides to go see the house firsthand. As they leave the comfort of town and walk deeper into the countryside, the air gradually changes, becoming colder, heavier, as though the world senses the direction of their path and recoils. The trail narrows until it becomes nothing more than a line of trampled grass leading through an overgrown field, forcing each step to become slower, more deliberate. Trees gather around the edges, twisted and bare, their branches creaking with a sound that feels almost like whispered warnings. Even the sky shifts its mood, clouds crawl across the sun, draining the color from everything, making the world appear pale and bruised. Yet each unsettling change only strengthens the pull that draws the protagonist forward, as if the house has been waiting and is now exerting its own kind of invitation. When the house finally comes into view, it stands alone at the top of a small rise, its sagging frame outlined against a sky that has turned the color of wet ash. The roof sags in places, the walls lean at odd angles, and the porch seems ready to collapse beneath the weight of a single touch. But the windows are the most disturbing part. Even from a distance, they look too dark, too deep, like open mouths silently screaming. The protagonist pauses, feeling the first true prick of unease, the kind that settles low in the stomach and warns that something is very wrong. But turning back feels impossible now. The house is no longer just a structure, it feels aware, alert, as if it has sensed the arrival of someone it has been waiting to meet. Each step up the hill makes the tension in the air thicken. The wind stops entirely. The world holds its breath. The protagonist reaches the rotten fence, places a hesitant hand on the gate, and feels the wood tremble slightly beneath their fingers. It is the first subtle hint that the house is not abandoned in the way ordinary buildings are abandoned, that something within still stirs, still watches, still welcomes those foolish enough to return its stare. The first sign that the house is aware does not arrive with a dramatic crash or a ghostly apparition but with something far subtler, something that slips beneath the surface of the moment before the mind has time to protest. When the protagonist steps over the threshold, the door swings inward without being touched, moving with a soft, deliberate slowness that feels almost polite. The air inside is still, too still, as though every particle is waiting. For a fleeting second, the protagonist tries to rationalize it as the wind or the storm outside, but the excuse feels thin. The house seems to pulse with a quiet energy, as if it recognizes the presence of someone new. As they take their first steps inside, the floorboards beneath their feet do not groan under the pressure the way neglected wood should. Instead, they shift slightly, not like something breaking but like something adjusting. The sensation is so faint that the protagonist questions whether they truly felt it at all, yet the unease crawls beneath their skin. The dim light that filters through the dusty windows flickers suddenly, not from lightning or from the dying day, but as though responding to movement within the house itself. Shadows stretch unnaturally long across the floor, crawling toward the walls as if to make room for the newcomer. When the protagonist lifts their flashlight, its beam trembles though their hand remains steady. The light lands on a hallway ahead, and as soon as it does, one of the doors along the corridor creaks open by a fraction, just enough to reveal darkness deeper than the rest of the house. It feels like an invitation. Or a warning. Or both. The sound is slow, controlled, purposeful. Houses do not open doors on their own, structures do not behave with intention, yet this one does, and the protagonist can no longer pretend otherwise. Footsteps echo from somewhere above, soft and slow, as though someone is pacing intentionally, neither hurried nor afraid. Dust drifts down from the ceiling with each step, settling gently onto the protagonist's shoulders. They call out, a shaky attempt to appear braver than they feel, but the house answers only with silence, and somehow that silence is louder than any response could have been. It is the kind of silence that seems to listen, to absorb, to wait for more. A sudden draft snakes down the hallway, cold enough to raise goosebumps along the protagonist's arms, yet no window is open, no door ajar. The sensation feels like breath against the skin, the kind of breath that comes from something not entirely visible. It becomes clear, with chilling certainty, that the house is not merely sheltering something alive but that the house itself is alive, watching, reacting, and responding to every move the protagonist makes. The portrait hanging on the wall does not draw attention immediately, it sits quietly among the dust and decay, its frame tarnished and cracked, blending into the gloom like any forgotten relic. But the longer the protagonist stands in its presence, the more the air around it seems to thicken, as if the painting exerts a weight of its own. At first glance, it appears to be an old depiction of a stern-looking figure dressed in outdated clothing, the kind of portrait that might have once hung proudly in a family home. The eyes, however, are wrong. They do not merely stare outward in that static way old portraits do, they seem alert, aware, as if observing the protagonist with a patience bordering on anticipation. The protagonist takes a step closer, studying the fine details. The brushstrokes are deliberate but unusually sharp, giving the figure an unsettling clarity. Shadows cling to the face with unnatural precision, and although the subject's expression is neutral, there is a tension in the jawline, a faint tightening around the mouth that suggests something restrained. Even then, nothing feels explicitly supernatural, just vaguely uncomfortable, the way certain childhood images linger in the mind at night. But when the protagonist looks away for a moment, just long enough to scan the hallway, just long enough for a breath, the sensation shifts. Something in the room feels different, as though a subtle rearrangement has occurred without sound. When they look back, the change becomes undeniable. The portrait's expression has altered. It is not dramatic, the mouth still holds its line, the head has not turned, but the eyes seem narrower, the brows drawn a fraction lower, giving the face a quietly menacing edge. The protagonist's pulse quickens, their rational mind insisting they must be mistaken, that memory is unreliable in dim light. To test it, they deliberately turn away and then glance back again. This time, the alteration is clearer. The subject's lips have lifted at one corner, forming the ghost of a smirk, a smile too faint to be friendly. It feels like the painting is responding to being watched, as though it enjoys the attention. A wave of dread settles over the protagonist as they notice something else, something far more disturbing. The bone structure, the tilt of the chin, the small scar above the eyebrow, details that should not be present, details that belong not to a painted stranger but to the protagonist themselves. The portrait is shifting, evolving, reshaping its features with every stolen glance, gradually molding into a distorted reflection. And with each transformation, the eyes grow sharper, more knowing, as if for the moment the protagonist decides they have seen enough, a quiet determination settles in their chest, urging them to leave the house before its strange behaviors escalate further. They turn toward the front door, expecting to step back into the cold night air, but the house denies them that simple escape in the eeriest way possible. The doorknob turns easily, the door swings open without resistance, yet instead of the porch and storm outside, the protagonist is met with the same long hallway they just left behind. For a beat, they stand frozen, their mind scrambling to make sense of the impossible. The hallway stretches ahead, lined with the same doors, dim lights flickering faintly, shadows trembling as if trying to stay still. They step back, slam the door shut, and turn around to find a new exit, but every direction they choose folds back into the hallway again, like the house is twisting its insides to keep them contained. Breathing becomes shallow, each inhale heavy with the realization that this place is manipulating its own structure. The protagonist rushes down the hallway, heart pounding, reaching out to brush their fingers along the walls, feeling the wallpaper shift slightly beneath their touch, as though the house itself is breathing. Doors slam shut behind them with soft but deliberate thuds, not loud enough to frighten with noise but chilling in their precision, like a predator closing the distance one silent step at a time. The hallway seems to lengthen with each stride, stretching impossibly far, swallowing all sense of orientation. When they try opening one of the side doors, hoping for a window, a staircase, anything that might break the loop, they are confronted with more hallways, branching out into identical corridors that all lead back to the same place. A creeping suspicion takes hold that the house is guiding them rather than trapping them mindlessly. The lights flicker in rhythmic patterns, subtly brighter when the protagonist moves in one direction and dimming when they turn another. It feels like the walls are herding them, nudging them deeper into the maze, urging them toward something unseen. Each loop makes the air heavier, thicker with tension, and the whisper of footsteps behind them grows more pronounced, echoing just out of sync with their own steps, as though something is following close enough to mimic but not yet reveal itself. Panic claws at their throat, but the fear sharpens their awareness, making every sound in the house feel like a coded message. It becomes clear that the house is not simply a location but an entity capable of bending reality, folding distance, and rearranging its shape with a strange intelligence. The protagonist realizes they are no longer exploring the house but navigating a living labyrinth designed not to confuse them by accident, but to lead them exactly where it wants them to go. House is using the portrait to study the protagonist, to learn them, to mimic them, to claim them, one slow and chilling adjustment at a time. The moment the voice speaks the protagonist's name, every thread of the house's strange behavior snaps into chilling clarity. It is not a random whisper drifting through empty rooms, not the creak of settling wood or the groan of old pipes. It is deliberate, layered, and disturbingly intimate. The voice sounds human at first, soft, breathy, almost familiar, but beneath it lies something deeper, a chorus of countless whispers overlapping like leaves rustling underwater. Each voice seems to belong to someone different, some pleading, some angry, some exhausted, all merging into a single sound that slithers into the protagonist's ears. Hearing their own name spoken by such a twisted symphony shakes them to their core, not just because it recognizes them, but because it suggests the house has been waiting. The protagonist freezes, unable to decide whether to run or remain still, as the air around them thickens with an oppressive warmth. It feels like exhalation, as though the house itself is breathing onto their skin. The voice calls their name again, this time slower, savoring each syllable, stretching it into something uncomfortably intimate. It echoes down the hallway, bouncing off the walls in a way that defies acoustics, sounding as though it comes from everywhere at once, behind them, above them, inside the very walls. A cold tremor slips through their spine as they realize the house is not only aware but attentive, focusing its vast, unseen consciousness entirely on them. A memory stirs suddenly, a strange sense of familiarity they cannot place. It is as if this moment has been lived before, as if the house has imprinted itself on their mind long before they ever stepped inside. That thought alone intensifies the terror because it implies a reach far beyond its crumbling walls. The protagonist turns slowly, expecting to see someone, or something, behind them, but the hallway remains empty, though the shadows seem to pulse with a faint, eager rhythm. Each whisper in the layered voice grows more distinct, forming fragmented words, fragments of past lives, maybe even warnings, though their overlapping nature makes them almost impossible to decipher. Footsteps begin to echo, not in sync with the protagonist's breath or heartbeat, but in sync with the house's voice, like an unseen presence is taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. The air vibrates with an energy that feels ancient and hungry. The protagonist finally understands the dark truth behind the rumor. People never returned because the house did not merely trap them, it absorbed them, their voices, their memories, their essence, weaving them into the chorus now speaking. And by calling the protagonist's name with such certainty, the house reveals a final, horrifying certainty that their arrival was never accidental, that they were not a visitor who stumbled into its grasp but someone the house had chosen long before they ever crossed its threshold. The whispers swelled until they became a suffocating tide, rising and folding over each other, pressing against the walls, the floor, the air itself. The protagonist backed away, palms slick with sweat, searching desperately for any break in the looping hallways, any doorway that did not lead them back into the house's endless maze. The lights above flickered faster, each pulse revealing the shadows stretching, thinning, reaching like long fingers crawling across the ceiling. Somewhere deep within the walls came a low groan, like the entire structure was waking fully, shaking off centuries of dormancy. The voice said their name one last time, not as a whisper but as a declaration, a sound that reverberated through their bones. The walls shuddered. The floor lurched. A door at the far end of the hall creaked open, releasing a warm, unnatural glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The protagonist knew, instinctively, that this was where the house had been guiding them all along. Every loop, every shifting hallway, every whisper had been nudging them toward this single point. They tried to run the other way, but the floors tilted beneath their feet, pulling them forward. The house no longer bothered with subtlety. It wanted them. It had chosen them. The glow grew brighter, washing the walls in a sickly amber hue. The door widened, stretching impossibly until it resembled a gaping mouth, its frame bending like flesh instead of wood. The chorus of voices grew frantic, not pleading but eager, overlapping into a single distorted breath that filled the space around them. The protagonist fell to their knees as the air thickened, pulling at their limbs. The portrait they had seen earlier appeared at the end of the hall without explanation, standing upright against the wall as though it had always been there. But now the figure inside was an exact mirror of the protagonist, wearing their fear, their trembling posture, their wide, desperate eyes. And slowly, with deliberate clarity, the painted version of themselves smiled. A final, irresistible pull dragged the protagonist toward the gaping door. The glow swallowed their shadow first, then their breath, then their scream. The moment their fingers brushed the threshold, the house exhaled in satisfaction, and the door slammed shut with a soft, final click that echoed through every room. The light stilled. The hallway straightened. The whispers faded into a dull, contented hum.